and thanks again for your warm welcome. Tonight we look at Thomas Boston, Latimer Samuel Rutherford, and between the two men there lie a whole series of very dramatic events in Scottish history. Boston is primarily an 18th century figure. He was born in 1676 and died in 1732. And his working life covers the first 32 years of that tumultuous 18th century. You can recall for yourself some of the main events of the time since Rutherford died in 1660. You have the restoration of Charles II in that year, and there follows a great Covenanting struggle down to 1688, culminating, as you recall, in the killing times when thousands perished on the moors of the southwest of Scotland. I tend to describe those years as the Scottish Presbyterian Holocaust. Some 16,000 people were killed by the dragoons during those years. There was a reign of terror beyond what we can imagine. It was a capital crime in those years to attend the field preachers, to attend conventicles, and it was a crime even to harbour or give hospitality to anyone attending those conventicles. And fathers could be imprisoned for helping their children, husbands for harbouring their wives, and so on. And everyone lived in a climate of total suspicion, where there was pressure within families for members to inform the one on the other. The dragoons and their spies were everywhere. And it is, I think, to the greatest credit of our education system that we fail to give due prominence to this era of our history and to its momentous input to our own democratic struggle. The Covenanters were portrayed by Sir Walter Scott as intolerant killjoys, and sometimes they were lacking in joy. But Scott forgot what those people had suffered, the trauma of those killing times. And I have no embarrassment or compunction about comparing them to the Jews of our own century. The whole of the Israeli psyche is dominated by the memory of the Holocaust. And the whole of the psyche of the Presbyterians of the late 17th century and early 18th century is dominated by the memory of the killing times. And that they were sometimes not all that interested in the fine arts. It's not surprising considering all that they had been through. In 1788 we had, of course, the Revolution, which brought in William of Orange and Mary. And then we had in 1707 the Treaty of Union with England, which again was a momentous event. And in 1715, Boston lived through the first Jacobite rebellion. So these were, by any standards, exciting times. Let me first of all remind you of the main events of Boston's life. He was licensed in 1697. He was ordained to his first charge in Simperin 2 years later. It is very interesting that this man of outstanding ability and talent had to wait 2 years for his first charge. This was because at that time you would have a patron to secure your presentation to a charge in the Church of Scotland, and Boston was fairly uncompromising in his preaching style, especially in his early years, and very much given to commenting on what he called public sins. It appears that his preaching changed over the years, not only in its content but also in its tone, and also indeed in his own inner attitude. He was always shy. I'll come back to that later on. But in his early years, he said that once he closed the door of the pulpit, all his shyness vanished, and he became bold and fearless. And I suppose that fearlessness didn't ingratiate him very much with potential patrons. What I find intriguing is that this wore off, and in later years he was often, he himself thought, discomposed and timid in the pulpit itself. Now, that did not lead him to compromise on the message. But it is interesting that as he got older, he became not more fearless, but more fearful. And perhaps some of you can follow that yourselves, that sometimes our own moods as we preach undergo sea changes. And that happened certainly in the case of Boston. The timid man in those early years ceased to be timid once he entered the pulpit. But later it was still a problem for him to face a public audience. And he says at one point that virtually every Sunday morning he rose to a great feeling of spiritual dryness and deadness against which he had to wrestle. He was in Simprint for 8 years and then moved to the not too distant parish of Ettrick near Selkirk in the year 1707. It's interesting that he was inducted to Ettrick on the 1st of May of that year, the very day that the union with England came into effect. So on this momentous day in our own UK history, Boston began this ministry in the very humble parish of Ettrick. He records in his diary, in his memoirs for that period, and this will hearten all members of the SNP, I was not for the Union, he says, then or now. I was ever against it. So you can claim Boston as one of your earliest Presbyterian nationalists. He also indicates that at that time he wasn't in very good health. Boston never was in good health. And like many men in my profession, he was slightly inclined towards hypochondria. And he records constant variations in his own physical health. And he says at this point, when he goes to Ettrick, I looked, he said, more like a man bound for the other world than a man bound for another parish. He was looking, I think, rather poorly. Now, it is an intriguing part of God's providence that Boston spent its entire ministry in those 2 insignificant and remote rural parishes in the Scottish borders. And he himself makes a very fine comment in this connection when he goes to Ettrick, because sometimes we might ourselves feel that we are useless and in rather sterile and unimportant situations. He says of Ettrick, quite simply, it is not a big parish, but it is my parish. And to that parish he gave himself with unstinting zeal and with constant daily and hourly devotion. And I don't mean simply in terms of his physical activity and visitation and so on, but he gave them the very best of his own intellect and fed them with the wheat of his own well-digested theology. And it should be an inspiration to many of us that Boston did not feel remotely tempted not to bother and not to study because of the fewness of its parishioners or because of the limitations of their education. It's quite evident that many of Boston's colleagues felt sorry for him. And he himself sums it up very succinctly in those terms. Some, he says, think I should be happy because I have so few parishioners. And others think I should be sad and wretched because my stipend is so small. But he didn't measure his situation either by the number of this flock or by the size of his stipend. He saw it simply as a sphere in which God had placed him. While my mind runs in this groove too, there is another thing in common in Boston with regard to his ethnic parishioners. Boston was adept at illustration, at what he called similitudes, so we might call parables. And he recalled the definition of a parable, which was at one time very current and still may be. A parable defined as an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And he said, I used many of those similitudes and parables, but I found afterwards in discussing the sermon with my parishioners that many remembered, he said, the earthly story, but few remember the heavenly meaning. And that's a hazard in all illustration. Boston is best remembered today as a theological author. And I want to linger for a moment over some of those productions of his pen. There are, in fact, 12 massive volumes of Boston's writings extant, and they range over a wide panorama of theological issues. But some of them are of outstanding importance, and I want to mention one or two of them. His first book was a very small publication called A Soliloquy on the Art of Man-Fishing. He wrote it on the eve of his induction to Simperin in 1699, and it is a reflection on the responsibilities of the ministry and the best way to conduct oneself as a fisher of men. It's based on that text, come, and I'll make you fishers of men. And it is a superb little production, despite being written when Boston was only 21 years of age, and I do commend it to you if you do come across it. I'm not going to quote much from it. There's just one sentence that has lived with me, and it is this. Reflecting on the powerlessness of preaching apart from God's Spirit, Boston says, a man may preach like an angel and still be useless. And that is an extremely solemn thing, because often you hear great preaching and you wonder why nothing happens. But without the Lord it is in vain. We may preach like angels and still be useless. There is mercifully, of course, a converse or corollary to that, and it is this, that we may preach like earthen vessels and still be useful. And sometimes it is quite instructive to go back to the preaching which maybe had the great revivals and see how ordinary much of that preaching actually was. And if it's true that we may preach against it, we may also preach in a very human way and still be recognized by God's blessing. And then there was another volume of Boston's called A Crook in the Lot. This again is a very small publication, and it reflects the anguish of much of Boston's life and especially the illness, the lifelong illness of his very much beloved and esteemed wife. And the text on which this one is based is, can a man make straight for the Lord is made crooked? And it reflects very profoundly on the mysteries of human suffering and human pain. Just one or two points to quote from this very useful and convenient volume. He says at one point, as to the crook in thy lot, he says, God hath made it. And for Boston, that seemed to be all the theodicy and comfort that he needed. Sovereignty, he says at one point in his memoirs, sovereignty requires a wide latitude, and I must give it to him. God must have space to do as he pleases. So the crook in thy lot, God hath made it. He says at another point, the world is a wilderness, and we may get moved from station to station. But each station, he says, is a wilderness station. We have here no continuing city. We may move from joy to joy, from sorrow to sorrow, from sorrow to more intense sorrow. But all of these, Boston says, are but wilderness stations. And there is a realism too in Boston. He did not believe that pain or suffering in themselves were at all inherently sanctifying, or that by themselves such things made you more gracious or sweeter in soul or closer to God. On the contrary, Boston says, there is nothing that gives temptation more easy access than the crook in the lot. There is nothing that gives temptation more easy access than the crook in the lot. And he says again that every crook in the lot stimulates our own corruption. So there is no romantic belief in Boston that the more you suffer, the more saintly you necessarily become. And then, of course, there was Boston's famous magnum opus, Human Nature in its Fourfold State. This is a remarkable publication. It was written or published in 1720, and within the next 50 years, it ran through no fewer than 30 editions. It's remarkable because it consists of sermons preached to his own ethnic congregation. Boston held nothing back theologically. It was Phillips Brooks who said once in his lectures on preaching, preach all the theology you know. That's what Boston did to the shepherds and farmers and housewives of a Celtic parish. To them he preached this great series of sermons on the nature of man. Those four states, the analysis itself is brilliant. Humanity in its fourfold state, the state of innocence, the state of nature, the state of grace, and the state of glory. It is in a way a complete survey of the whole range of Christian doctrine. And at one time it was probably to be found in every single home in Scotland. It has had enormous influence. And that may be behind a comment which Rabbi Duncan made once on Thomas Boston. Duncan said that Boston was a commonplace genius. And that is a very interesting summation, it's an interesting phrase in many ways. Boston did not have glittering literary talents. He wasn't a brilliant stylist or a brilliant orator. There is something commonplace in the level of Boston's intellect. And yet, that book reached more homes and influenced more believers and more preachers than any other single production of Scottish theology. So these were Boston's main publications: the Fourfold State, his Crook and the Lot, and his work, The Art of Man Fishing. He wrote many other things, like his work on the Covenant of Grace. He wrote a 3-volume body of divinity, which surveys the whole of systematic theology based on the Shorter Catechism. And there is a certain pathos in the further fact that Boston spent many, many years of his life writing a book on the accents of the Hebrew text. Boston was a very diligent scholar. He was also a very capable linguist, but he had a very limited library. And there's one poignant moment when his members were recalls when a very posh minister came once to visit him in his manse at Simprin and looked at Boston's collection of books, about a dozen books. And Boston never forgot the sneer, the supercilious sneer that came on that minister's face, and it cut him to the quick. He built up his library in the years that followed, but he never did have the means to buy many, many books. As I said, he spent many years in the Hebrew text, which in many ways is a mystery to me as it is to many of you. There are all kinds of signs. The Hebrew text, in its definitive form, is simply a collection of consonants. In its definitive form, it does not have vowels, nor punctuation, nor accents. Now, the vowels have considerable authority, almost total authority. The punctuation is itself a post-composition introduction, of course. But Boston was convinced that the accents too, the stresses that were put into the text by whoever, that these too were inspired. We now know that those accents are not original and have no authority, but it was Boston's magnum opus at an academic level. He wrote it first in English and could find no publisher, and then in Latin, and had it published eventually in Amsterdam. I have seen a copy, but I have never made my way through it. You will not be too surprised by that. But it's intriguing to think that this man became absolutely fascinated by those accents. So much for Boston's authorship. I want to turn for a moment now to the question of Boston's involvement in a very famous controversy of the 18th century church in Scotland called the Marrow Controversy. I'm not going to discuss this in detail, but I do want to say just a little about it. It is called the Marrow Controversy because it was occasioned by a book called The Marrow of Modern Divinity. And there is a curious irony in the fact that this major Scottish controversy, which had ongoing implications for Scottish church history, was in fact occasioned by an English Puritan publication. The Marrow was published in England, in London, in 1645 by an author whom we know only by the initials E.F. There has been much speculation as to who E.F. was. That speculation, in my view, has been totally indecisive and inconclusive. The Marrow owes its title to the fact that it is a compilation of quotations from various authors who were then modern. And it is a very skillful compilation of quotations from, for example, Luther and Calvin, and more particularly English Puritans such as Ball, Preston, and so on. And these quotations are woven into a very skillful dialogue about fundamental gospel considerations or questions. And you can gather the nature of those questions from the names of the various characters involved in the dialogue. There is, first of all, a gentleman called Theophatus, who is a young, newly converted Christian. There is another gentleman who is called Nomista, who is a legalist. There is one called Antinomista, who is an antinomian who says in the law has no place in the Christian life. And there is an even more interesting character called Neomista, who has a new form of gospel legalism. I'll come back to him in a moment. And then there is Evangelista, the evangelical or gospel preacher. And between them, these men discuss various issues with regard, for example, to the place of the law in the Christian life, the motivation of believers to they obey God because of the fear of hell and the hope of heaven. Questions about assurance, is assurance of the essence of faith. Questions about whether we are justified on account of faith. In other words, is faith itself a work? And above all, questions about the free offer of the gospel. Now, Boston came across this book shortly after he went to his first parish in Simpron. He was visiting one day in a home in his parish, and he saw on the windowsill two books. He was given a loan of both of them, and he said, I didn't care for one of them, which was in fact a book by Saltmarsh, a well-known English antinomian. But the other one, he said, the Marrow of Modern Divinity, I took it home and I relished it. And he relished it because he had been wrestling as a Calvinist with the question of the way he should offer Christ to sinners. The question, of course, if we believe in election, do we offer Christ only to the elect, only to the prepared, only to the seeking, or do we offer him to all men indiscriminately? And Boston had come to the view, as a young theologian, and this is quite intriguing, that men and women indefinitely had a divine right to Christ. Men and women indefinitely had a right to Christ, simply as human beings. And he, as a preacher of the gospel, was obligated to offer Christ to all men and women indiscriminately. Now, this is interesting for many reasons, not least because Boston is portrayed as an arch Calvinist driven by nothing but his belief in predestination. There is a very important book by the famous Scottish Jewish literary scholar called David Deiches, a book called God and the Poets, a superb book in many ways, in which Boston is portrayed as the object of much of Rabbi Burns' diatribes against Scottish Calvinism. And Deiches argues that the high Calvinism of Boston fully merited the attacks that Burns made upon it, as Boston preached nothing but fatalistic predestination. Now, on the contrary, Boston, more perhaps than any other Scottish preacher, preached Christ fully, freely, and unfetteredly to what he called sinners of mankind lost. Later on, you'll find other notorious Calvinists, such as Adam Gibb of the Secession, taking the same view and saying, and you may find this, some of you, even disturbing, that you preach Christ in the same terms to the reprobate as you do to the elect. There are no two ways of preaching the gospel. There are two responses to that gospel. But there's only one gospel, and it is in the same terms to all sinners, elect and reprobate. Gibb was building very much on the Boston legacy when he said that. Now, it is incidentally worth noting that hyper-Calvinism, the belief that we are not to preach Christ fully and freely to all men, never had a footing in the Scottish Church. Our Calvinism was never reluctant, never inhibited from offering Christ fully and freely to all men. And the reason why Boston so loved the Marrow was that in the Marrow he found, among other things, this doctrine. Now, he found also, of course, the idea that our motivation does not come from fear, but it comes from the love of Christ. He found the doctrine, too, that our assurance is based on the perception of Christ, not on the perception of our own graces or our own personal qualities. But above all, he found in the Marrow from those English Puritans remarkable statements with regard to the fullness and freeness of the gospel. Now, I say remarkable because it's a very curious thing if you go back into that early Puritan period. When the Marrow was first published, 1645, it was published with the imprimatur. Now, you may wonder, what on earth was the imprimatur? Well, you know that in Roman Catholicism there is an index of prohibited books. And those that are not prohibited have a Vatican stamp on them that says nihil obstat. There is no objection to this book being published. Now, the Westminster Assembly, which met from 1643 to 1647, it had its own group of theological triers, men who read books and said these books are okay. And it's intriguing to me that the Assembly appointed no less than Joseph Carroll, a very famous Puritan theologian, to examine this book, the Marrow, and Carroll, in the Assembly's name, pronounced the book sound and wholesome. Carroll, just to relieve the pressure on you for a moment, is best known as the author of a commentary on the book of Job, and it runs to 8 volumes. And there's a famous say too that he emptied his church in the process of preaching those sermons on Job. That happened in Puritan days as well. You could empty your church by your preaching. So Carroll did that. There's a marvelous story about C.H. Spurgeon, who, when he went to one of his early manses as a young minister, was faced with yards of empty bookshelves. And the story goes that Spurgeon ordered a collection of dummy books to fill those spaces, and wrote on the spine of each of those dummy books the title Job on Carroll. So that was, but at the same time, Spurgeon did very much recommend Carroll on Job, I hasten to add. But I'm going to give you one or two statements on the Marrow in a moment, and they might make your hair rise in some instances. And I want you to remember that this book had the imprimatur of Carroll and the Westminster Assembly. But I'll just quote really one of those statements on the Marrow, if I can recall it precisely. The Marrow says at one point, and Boston fully endorses this, "Tell every man, I have good news for you. Christ is dead for you." Tell every man, I have good news for you. Christ is dead for you. Now, the Marrow didn't say, tell all the elect, I have good news for you. But tell every man, every woman, every boy and girl, tell them all, I have good news for you. And the good news is, Christ is dead for you. Or the Marrow also said, there is a crucified Christ for you to come to. And if you come to him, you will have life and salvation by him. There is a crucified Christ for you to come to. The Marrow also said that the gospel preacher comes with a deed, title deeds to a great estate, a deed of gift and grant of Christ to mankind lost. It is a deed made out by God. It offers Christ, and it offers Christ to every sinner of mankind lost. And all you have to do is to sign your name. Who is the deed made out to? It is made out in favor of mankind lost. And every member of that race is entitled to claim that gift, because he can say, that deed is in my name, because I belong to mankind lost. That is what prompted Rabbi Duncan again to make the famous comment, sin is the handle by which I get Christ. I don't read in the New Testament anywhere that Christ came to save John Duncan. But I read that he came to save sinners. John Duncan is a sinner, therefore Christ came to save John Duncan. A deed of gift and grant made out to sinners of mankind lost. So there was Boston, confirmed in his own theology by this great Puritan publication, The Marrow of Modern Divinity. Now let me say in passing that if you come within partition distance of the Marrow, then sell your shirt and buy it. It is a superb book, it is a racy book, and it is full of spiritual meat from beginning to end. It's a very curious thing. The Marrow has gone through many editions since this great controversy, and every single edition but one has been printed with Boston's own voluminous notes. And those notes of Boston's themselves are worth their weight in gold. So this book I commend to you unhesitatingly and unreservedly. The Marrow by itself, the Marrow with Boston's notes, even more useful. Boston commended the book to his own circle of friends, and as a consequence it was published in Scotland in 1718 with a commendation by Boston's friend James Hogg of Carnock. And it was no sooner published than there was a tremendous outcry. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in the details of this, but by this time, the seeds of the church of Scotland was dividing along party lines. By 1740, those lines would represent moderates on the one side, evangelicals on the other side. The lines in 1718 were not that clearly drawn, but there were two tendencies, one towards legalism. Now, the legalists, they weren't heretical. On the contrary, they officially stood for an qualified acceptance of the confession and of its language, and I suppose that above all, they wanted to avoid anything that savoured of antinomianism, or that might encourage looseness of living or immorality, or perhaps that might endanger the body politic and bring in any kind of instability, because it was a very unstable time with the Jacobites and the Episcopalians and the Roman Catholics, and everybody who was in power in church or state was very anxious to keep the lid on anything that had the remotest tendency to unsettle the population. In the Church of Scotland, this group was led by a gentleman who was unfortunately known as Principal Haddo. And that's enough to put me off being a principal for life, but I can't always dictate what people call me. Principal Haddo preached a famous sermon at the synod of which he was moderator around 1719 on the errors and heresies of the marrow. And as a consequence, the Assembly referred the book to a committee on purity of doctrine. There had been some unsettledness in the church going back to 1710. Let me watch again the details of this, but there was a committee on purity of doctrine established in 1710. And I've only mentioned this because it was established because of a very interesting development. In the Auchterarder Presbytery, they had introduced their own particular creed, which required all licentiates to subscribe to. Now, if you ask me how and why a presbytery could do that, I'll tell you, but I'll tell you in private. We don't want too much detail. But in this particular creed, there was a remarkable statement, and it was to this effect: it is erroneous to say that we must forsake sin in order to come to Christ. It is erroneous to say that we must forsake sin in order to come to Christ or before coming to Christ. Now, that's hair-raising, just like Luther's famous statement, sin boldly. And it comes, of course, on the same quarter. It is a shocking statement, as are many of the Lord's statements, but it contains an important grain of truth. If you don't come to the Lord till you have renounced sin, then you'll never come to the Lord. You come to Christ as a sinner, purely and simply as a sinner. And that's the truth of that creed it was trying to express. Now, the Assembly condemned the creed and condemned that statement and set up this committee on purity of doctrine. And this committee in 1720 roundly condemned the marrow. And they condemned it under 6 headings, which I more or less indicated before, not least that the marrow contradicted the doctrine of limited atonement and taught universal atonement, which of course it did not. But it is a remarkable thing that on the one hand, Boston is slated by Deiches for being an extreme die-hard hyper-Calvinist. At the same time, in his own day, he's condemned by those who would become the moderates for being a universal redemptionist. Such is the fate of those who want to steer a path between those two extremes. So the marrow was condemned. And that meant that no Church of Scotland minister could commend the Marrow or commend any of its doctrines. If he did, he was in contempt of the assembly. Now, Boston and his colleagues dissented, and Boston tried to protest, but wasn't allowed to. When he gave his protest in, the assembly immediately rose and was adjourned, and so the protest was never in fact lodged. But it's interesting that Boston and his friends continued to advocate the Marrow doctrine and continued to recommend the Marrow as a book. And controversy simmered on for 2 years afterwards, but they were never disciplined for defying the Assembly's directive. The reason people think that happened was that there was a directive from on high not to divide the church in 1720, just after 1715 and the Jacobite Revolution. And I think that that's probably true. There was pressure from very high government sources to protect the Marrow men at a political level. I won't burden you beyond this, that when Boston then issued his own edition of the Marrow with his own notes, he did so anonymously. And he called himself simply a lover of peace, Philistor Irenaeus. And he did so because he says, and this is, I think, slightly devious, that he did not want to be seen to be in contempt of the Assembly's decision, and hence he didn't use his own name. But whatever the device used, he did go ahead and defy the Assembly in this particular regard. Now, I said that the Marrow controversy had important consequences. The two parties became at last evangelicals and moderates. And there is an interesting lesson in the fact that the moderate party began as a party of hyper-orthodoxy, too frightened to preach justification by faith alone, because it seemed to be antinomian, and they wanted a moderate religion. Now, they were never heretics, they were simply moderates. They wanted a lukewarm, socially stabilizing and church-stabilizing religion. The more important thing was that out of the Marrow group there came the Secession Church. The Secession came into being in 1733, led by Ebenezer Erskine and the famous Erskines again, like Ralph Erskine and others, a distinguished family. Now, Boston died in 1832. But had Boston lived, he too would have joined the Secession Church. And I'm going to stop at that because of this particular topic, because it gets rather intricate when we look at all the secessions that followed and the eventual emergence of the UP Church and its impact on Scottish church history. So I'm going to change track completely, and I want to go back to a book I haven't mentioned, but which is a book of enormous importance, and that is a book with a simple title of The Memoirs of Thomas Boston. Now, this book, which I have in my hand here, is not as well known as Rutherford's Letters or some other Scottish publications, but it is an absolutely superb book, and I commend it to you most warmly. It was written by Boston for his own children, as a legacy to them, to help them in understanding where they had come from, and an encouragement to live in its own tradition of godliness. And it is written in a very readable style. It is vivid, and it has a great deal of what I can't but think is unconscious humour. And it brings out the man as a man quite superbly. The humanness of this man really is most interesting. I just want to itemize some of the features which I find so endearing, and that's the word I use advisedly with regard to Boston's memoirs, and as a result Boston himself. An 18th century Calvinist. First of all, there is Boston's sense of his own limitations, and this appears very clearly at many points in Boston's narrative. He had, in his own judgment, many faults. He was an extremely shy man, very diffident. He was not given to much speaking, and he was also given not only to hypochondria, but also to fits of melancholy, indeed to almost habitual melancholy, of which he himself is aware and of which he's actually very critical, and of which he makes some very wise comments. There is a very interesting statement with regard to those limitations, which I'm just going to read to you. It's not long. I am, he says, well, with respect to myself, and he writes this with regard to the period around 1711, I am very little serviceable with reference to public management, being exceeding defective in ecclesiastical prudence, and very little useful in conversation, being naturally silent. But the Lord has given me a pulpit gift, not unacceptable. In other words, he was saying, I'm not much use in public debate. I'm useless in church politics. I'm useless in one-to-one situations because I don't have the gift of small talk, an almost essential prerequisite for the ministry, and I don't say that lightly. It is a great shame that people despise the gift of small talk, because small talk builds pastoral bridges. But Boston seemed to himself not to have it. All these defects. This man who knew very clearly what he himself could not do. And add to that his melancholy, with regard to which again he is extremely realistic. And he says, melancholy is a friend to unbelief, and melancholy is the enemy of faith. He did not hold at all that melancholy or spiritual depression was a sign of some kind of spiritual superiority. Just as a crook in the lot was dangerous, so melancholy was dangerous as well. And Boston concluded from this list of limitations, that's why the Lord had left him in those small spheres, in those small charges. This tremendous instance of understatement where he says, the Lord has given me a pulpit gift not unacceptable. And he goes on to explain why he thinks the Lord has left him in Ettrick. I have been shut up, he says, where I had time for study. And he concludes that he was left in those small, limited rural situations because God wanted to study and to write. It should, of course, be borne in mind that there is a kind of sociological comment implicit in that. You would imagine that great intellects are only useful in urban situations among students and academics. But that's to forget the native intelligence of ordinary believers. And in my own experience, and my students wouldn't mind me saying so, I found it much more demanding to preach to Partick Highland people, none of whom were higher education products, than to lecture to students, because there is no link often between academic qualification and intelligence. Hugh Miller said on one occasion that educated folk know how to argue better, but they're not more intelligent. And there's great truth in that. Anyway, this here is Boston, was a sense of its own limitations, and saying, the Lord left me here because I was meant to be a student and possibly also a writer. He also faced many vexations, and I'm not going to go into those in detail either. To begin with, he wasn't wanted in either parish. And it took a long, long time to win the confidence of its people, particularly in Ettrick. When he went to Ettrick, he was opposed by the gentry in the parish because of its opposition to the union. And in actual fact, the day that his call was being disposed of by the presbytery, he was fairly confident they would turn him down. And he was, in fact, hoping that they would, and that he might be quit of it, once they knew his views and how unacceptable he was to the heritors. But in God's providence, despite those objections, the call did go ahead. Shortly after that, Boston lost a large number of its people to the Cameronians, the RP Church. And if you ask why, it was because he observed a fast which had been called by the civil government. And Boston wasn't all that happy about it, but he did it. But the Cameronians, these people left the church on that pretext and went to the Cameronian church. And that reminds me of the main irritant throughout Boston's Ettrick ministry. There was this group of Cameronians, and they kept sniping at Boston all his years, and they kept losing people to them for all kinds of reasons, most often fairly trivial reasons. There were also the hardships that Boston suffered. Hardship, first of all, in the long time it took to get a call, hardship in the vexations I mentioned, but he was hurt. He was really hurt when he was most vulnerable. We'll see in a moment that Boston was a great romantic, and his marriage was a product of that romantic nature. But for most of his life, his wife was seriously, and I mean very seriously, ill. To crown that, they had 10 children, 6 of whom died in infancy. And you just imagine for yourselves the loss of one infant or young child. He buried 6 of them. In fact, I shouldn't quite say it that way, because on one occasion he was away from home for a few days, and on his return found that one of his boys had been already buried, one of his girls it was. She had died in his absence. They couldn't get in touch with him, and before he came home, she was buried. Now, 18th century or not, it was human nature that had to cope with that kind of sorrow. There is another very poignant moment when the child, I think, called Ebenezer, died. And as they're nailing the coffin down, and just enough, I should say, in parenthesis here, that Boston was present at the birth of all his children, with maybe one exception. And he remembers, as they were nailing the coffin of Ebenezer down, that he was overwhelmed with the realization that he had not kissed the dust of the dead child. And he realized that that dust was united to Christ. And had he been guilty of despising that dust and not kissing it? And he said, were it not for the bystanders, I would have demanded that they open it all over again so that I could kiss it. But he was unable to make that request. He says in the crook and the lot that the crook often comes where you are most vulnerable and most weak. I personally doubt whether that is so. It has not been so in my case. One can cope with most things, but could one cope with what Boston had to go through in the loss of his own children? There certainly he was hurt when he was most vulnerable. Boston also showed tremendous moral courage, and this is curious because he was such a timid man. On many occasions he holds out. For example, in the Marrow controversy, he protests against the Assembly's decision. In the 1720s, there is a heresy trial involving a Glasgow professor who denied the deity of Christ, and the Assembly failed to find that man guilty. And Boston was horrified. And he rose with all his diffidence in that assembly, and he said, as loudly as he could, I protest in my own name and in the name of all who will adhere to me. He looked round and saw that not a single soul in the assembly was standing but himself. And he simply said, I protest in my own name. It was a dishonor in his view done to Christ. Earlier on, he had also refused to take the abjuration oath, an oath which required ministers to swear allegiance to the sovereign. That oath was introduced to curb Episcopalian and Jacobite sentiment, but it was also imposed on Presbyterians, and most of them didn't mind, but it required acknowledgement of the sovereign as head of the Church of England. And Boston could not bring himself to do that, because he thought that that headship was entirely unbiblical. Now, from that day onwards, Boston could have been dismissed instanter from his post. It was a condition of holding any public office in Britain that you took that oath, but Boston would not take it. I want to close by looking at just two little bits with regard to Boston. One, I want to give you a little flavour of an 18th century communion season in the Borders area of Scotland. Now, I do that because many of you will think, I believe, that such things were found and are to be found only in the Scottish Highlands. But these great communion gatherings did not begin in the Highlands, they began in the south of Scotland, and they were very, very much part of Boston's ministry and Boston's life as a churchman. And he recalls in 1731 one such occasion, and I just want to give you a flavour of the scale of it and of the demands it made on local families in terms of hospitality in an era of poverty beyond our imagining. Boston begins by telling us that the distribution of tokens, he said, was most orderly. The tokens were there in 1731. The tokens distributed amounted to 777. There were 777 communicants. Now, that is a phenomenal number. And if you recall that in those days, each one sat at a table, a real table. They came forward in groups, group after group after group. That's why they had sometimes 20 and more sittings, because they came forward in such huge numbers and in groups. The collection over 3 days was £77, 13 shillings and 4p Scots. And he says there were about 90 strangers, 180 visitors to the communion. And he said 80 of them stayed with William Blake, husband of Isabel Bigger aforesaid. This poor family over 3 days had to entertain and accommodate 80 people. And having before, he says, baking for them half a bowl of meal for bread, bought 4 and 10p sterling worth of wheat bread, killed 3 lambs, and made 30 beds for the communion season in this poor rural parish. And I believe their neighbour Robert Bigger, Isabel's brother, would be much the same. This I record once for all, for a swatch of the hospitality of the parish, for God hath given this people a largeness of heart to communicate of their substance on these and other occasions also. And my heart has long been on that occasion, particularly for a blessing on their substance, with such a natural emotion as to have been begotten of my own body. He prayed that having given so much, the Lord would pay them back. And he adds almost prosaically, those within a mile of the church still had the far greater weight on solemn occasions. So 80 visitors in your home for a communion weekend. I want to look lastly at Boston's comments on his wife and the romance between them, because it's at some levels amusing, it's at some levels awe-inspiring. He first met her in 1698, before his ordination and induction, and I was quite amused by the qualities which attracted him to her, because they resonate to my comments on his hypochondria. What engaged me to her was her piety, parts, beauty, cheerful disposition, fitted to temper mine, and that I reckoned her very fit to see to my health. She was a doctor's daughter. And in fact, before that, he tells that he was taken ill when he was staying in this particular house. And by her advice, now I don't think she nursed him, but she advised those who did, I used wormwood boiled and applied to my stomach in linen bags. That was on his future wife's advice at the very first meeting. Later on, he has a much fuller statement, and it is a brilliant word portrait. And I doubt whether there is anywhere in Scottish literature any more brilliant romantic portrait in words. You see nothing but words. And here it is. Thus was I by all-wise providence yoked with my wife, with whom I have now, by the mercy of God, lived 30 years complete. A woman of great worth, whom I therefore passionately loved and inwardly honoured. A stately, beautiful and comely personage, truly pious and fearing the Lord, of unevenly temper, patient in our common tribulations and under her personal distress. A woman of bright natural powers, an uncommon stock of prudence, of a quick and lively apprehension in things she applied herself to, great presence of mind and surprising incidents, sagacious and acute in discerning the qualities of persons, and therefore not easily imposed upon, modest and grave in her deportment, but naturally cheerful, wise and affable in conversation, having a good faculty at speaking and expressing herself with assurance, endowed with a singular dexterity in dictating of letters, being a pattern of frugality and wise management of household affairs, therefore entirely committed to her, well fitted for and careful of the virtuous education of her children, remarkably useful to the countryside, both in the merchant and the forest, through her skill in physic and surgery, and finally a crown to me in my public station and appearances. Now, not much more could have been said about any sinful human being than that. He said earlier on, the difficulty was not to get to love her, but to bound it. This is the dry, high Calvinist. But the passage ends poignantly. During the time we have lived together hitherto, we have passed through a sea of trouble, as yet not seeing the shore, but afar off. He was impressed when he first saw that she would be good for his health. In fact, he nursed her for almost their entire marriage, from the birth of their first child. She had a very serious mental illness. I assume it was some form of acute clinical depression. And for the last 10 years of his life, she was confined to bed by that illness. And ironically, rather than she nurse him, he had to nurse her. But his love and devotion never abated. I have sometimes been like to be removed from her, she having had little continued health, except the first 6 weeks. Her death had oftentimes stared us in the face, and hundreds of arrows have pierced my heart on that score. And sometimes I have gone with a trembling heart to the pulpit, laying my account with being called out of it to see her expire. And now for the third part of the time we have lived together, namely 10 years complete, she has been under a particular rocking distress, fixed to her bed, in the which furnace the grace of God in her hath been brightened. Her powers continue to a wonder, and her beauty, which formerly was wont upon her recoveries, to be no vestige of the illness which she had been under, doth as yet now and then show some vestiges of itself. She outlived him, despite all those years of ill health and anxiety. It is a great tribute, I think, to his own strength of character that he was able to achieve so much in such domestic circumstances. I want to close with just one brief comment that Rabbi Duggan wants with regard to Thomas Boston. He said, I would have loved to sit at the feet of Jonathan Edwards to learn what true godliness is, and at the feet of Thomas Boston to learn how to practice it. And I commend Boston to you as a model by which we ourselves might build our lives. Well, I'll leave it there.